Welcome to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is an extract from my first book, The Green Queen from Java. It's a novel, it's a tale, a yarn intended to entertain you. Yes, it does reflect my experience of falling in love with Indonesia, my experience of falling in love with an Indonesian lady, and my increasing awareness of the paranormal and black magic. Or some might like to say my descent into madness, but it is just a novel. Any resemblance to real people is completely unintentional. Yes, it's based on my experience, so yes, it's based on people I've met and know, but amalgams or caricatures of them. I do mention real people and real life celebrities and hope that they, along with anybody who believes they've identified themselves, will forgive me. During my time staying on Jalan Wahid Hasim, I would move between Hotel Egret Tamarin and Hotel Egret Arcadia, whichever was the cheapest. I recall getting to either of the Egrets in the early evening from the airport, showering and dressing quickly, and waiting on the steps, sometimes for 90 minutes, so that I wouldn't miss a moment of Maddy's company. Next to the Hotel Egret Arcadia was the Dina Pub, which 30 years previously had been the place to go for expats. It still attracted the occasional Western business person staying close by. Apart from its convenience, what made Dina Pub was its owner, Paula, an elderly but still beautiful woman. One reviewer described her as a transvestite, which she would have been mortified to hear. In fact, she still had an American boyfriend, some 20 years younger than her. Paula had grown up in Bandung, but pushed her Manadoist heritage to the fore. Maddy and I became extremely close to Tanta Paula. She had fingers in every pie, and could even claim to be related to the then President Obama. Each new visitor to the Dina Pub would be shown pictures of Tanta Paula in Hawaii with Obama, often with incredulity. This same reviewer described the interior of Dina Pub as having been designed by Tim Burton. It was certainly eclectic, filled completely with curios and tribal antiques, bought when the bar opened some 40 years previously. I remember them mostly being from the Asmat people of southern Papua, but this simply reflected my then lack of knowledge. Although there was a rather nice Asmat bis which adorned the bar itself. There were two large figures concreted upon a wall dividing the bar. I later found these to be Nias, many large Dayak guardian figures, and two large Dayak wedding panels that I had thought to be Asmat shields. A number of Tarajan rice barn doors, often confused with funerary furnishings, based on the unique funerary practices, and chests, probably Batak, which were used with cushions as seats. The walls were covered with topeng, masks, wayang kulit and golok, and photos of old Batavia, Jakarta. But my favourite was a large Asmat canoe with natives paddling it. Again, I later discovered this was not Asmat, but Batak. The bar itself was mirrored with flags, football pendants and foreign currency pinned to it, reflecting Dina Pub's international clientele. There were curios and kitsch just everywhere. I remember a nice Dutch clock, an old cigarette machine, a large wooden figure of Pinocchio. I also remember plastic grapes hanging from the ceiling above the bar and intertwining with the hanging glasses. Away from the bar itself, the ceiling was decorated with large playing cards. Then at the back was a large cork board on which visitors pinned their business cards. Apart from the clutter, it was a little like theme bars all over the world that are decorated to plan, from Andy Thornton in Greetland, West Yorkshire. Our visits to Tanta Paula became less frequent. It was a long way from our house in South Jakarta. Well, not that far, but traffic is never light, whatever time of the day or night. Then there was less reason to go when another Manado East Paula stopped over seeing her warong on the other side of Jalan Wahid Hasim, where the ikan bakar richa richa, spicy barbecued fish, was better than in Manado itself. Opposite and behind the Dina Pub were girl bars catering for visitors from eastern Indonesia, one owned by the other Paula. One night a fight had occurred between Papuans and Ambonese over a girl, and a knife had been pulled and somebody killed. The bar was closed for a while, and I felt that the whole area never recovered from this. The event also alerted the attention of the Front Pembela Islam, the Islamic Defenders Front, the same group who were involved in the deposition and imprisonment of Ahok, who would raid the Dina Pub during Ramadan, demanding donations and destroying bottles of spirit. Even Tante Paula, with many years of experience of navigating Indonesia's bureaucracy, police and excellent contacts, could not do anything about the Front Pembela Islam. But what really killed off the Dina Pub was a new law forbidding the sale of beer from convenience stores. Spirits and wine had never been allowed. This was at first overinterpreted to include semi-permanent structures, i.e. warongs, which for some reason this institution that had been there 40 years was deemed to have been. The law would also have prevented me from drinking beer at Paula's warong, a happy memory of my early and more carefree times in Jakarta. Nevertheless, I was mortified when I heard that Dina's Pub was closing. Jakarta is in a constant state of redevelopment, and such changes are a part of living in this mega city. Both Paula's bars were wanted for another hotel. What a coincidence that the redevelopment coincided with interest from Front Pembela Islam. When the Dina Pub closed, a little bit of my Jakarta died, and with it some early and magical memories of my time with Maddy. Tante Paula retired to Sentul above Bogor, something she had been threatening to do for a long time. Lacking a car, we had never visited her in Sentul, but would dearly love to see her again. Patrick grew up in a rough part of North Manchester, and he'd been bullied at school. As a result, he never achieved. Since leaving school, he'd become an autodidact and knows a little about everything, sometimes considerably more. He'd also taught himself martial arts and was supremely fit, and therefore he was able to earn a little as a bodyguard. But really he's a wheeler and dealer and trader in all and nothing. On leaving the UK, Patrick had been of immense help in turning some of my possessions into cash. He also visited Maddy and I in Jakarta and had been taken around its museums by Pa Erte. One of Patrick's outlets was eBay, and he often suggested that I should buy local crafts, jewellery and tribal art from Indonesia. As soon as I heard the news of Dina's Pub's closure, I contacted Patrick to suggest he buy the entire contents, which he had visited during his time in Jakarta. Despite being a trader, Patrick procrastinates and asked me to find out the shipping prices. I was also concerned about dealing with Indonesia's notorious customs, in that neither of us could risk a problem on our first shipment, and perfectly illustrating the impediments to investment within the Indonesian economy. Such fears were not unfounded, as years later the post office held up some exports I was making for 3 months until they came back with a spurious regulation to destroy my fledgling business. It all got too complicated to do a deal with Paula's son, so I ended up buying the few pieces I could save before the bulldozers moved in, although I understand some others did make their way to Sentul. I did manage to rescue my canoe and the Asmat bis, but the Nias warriors were too firmly cemented onto the dividing wall, whilst Maddy took Pinocchio, which everyone hates, although it entertains Ma for hours. In my experience, ghosts are fascinated by statues, toy figures and stuffed animals. To my horror, I found some of these very same antiques for sale on Jalan Surabaya. I had often heard that about Jalan Surabaya, and despite the shock, was delighted to have finally gone there, not least because there is a wonderful South Vietnamese restaurant on it. Not much on Jalan Surabaya is what it seems, with antiques being manufactured in the industrial estates of Tangga and Banten and artisan workshops to the south of Jogja. The existence of so many fakes has destroyed the market for Indonesia's tribal art post-1960, with few collectors being bothered to spend the time and money on authentication, meaning that genuine artifacts can sell for less than the fakes. As I delved a little further, I realised that what I had bought from Tanta Paula was a little more honest than the tourist pieces on Jalan Surabaya, if only by virtue of their age, and furthermore, some had some claim to being authentic, whatever that means in the world of Indonesian antiques. It would seem that prior to around 1970s, these workshops were unknown, and often valuable tribal antiques could be bought cheaply across Indonesia. Since then, authentication has become a major issue, with many museums around the world displaying works of questionable provenance. Determined to track down something more honest, I had heard about antique shops on the road to Ciputat, not far from our home in South Jakarta. As soon as we entered them, I realised that they were completely different to the stalls on Jalan Surabaya. Although when we inquired about the prices, they were often more expensive than in the West. This is not uncommon in Jakarta, most traders looking to maximise their profits on a single sale, rather than creating a high turnover. Even supermarkets mark up by an average of 30%, whilst their discounts are never passed on at the checkout, meaning that inaccuracies on your bill are always in their favour. What this means is that whilst inexpensive, Jakarta can prove to be as expensive as a provincial European city like Manchester, and considerably more expensive if you're determined to surround yourself with Western, inverted commas, luxury items. On the plus side, there are still many independent retailers who are able to undercut the chains and maintain a living, providing the landlords don't become too greedy. I had already begun selling what I had bought, and it was tough going, with prices low and sales rather difficult. Rather surprisingly, the least authentic pieces were selling the best. I guess those making for tourists understand the market, whereas honest antiques were rarely made to appeal to international buyers. So though I liked what I saw, there was no way I could develop this into a business. When we came across a smaller shop, full of tribal antiques from all over Indonesia, but a large number from Sumba and Sumbawa, similar to Asmat, which I love, it was crammed so full that they could not properly be displayed. I said Assalamu alaikum to the lady in the shop, who I now know to be Ibu Dianti, Parag Abaya's wife from Semarang. There you go again, my need to classify people by location. As soon as she spotted me, she called Parag Abaya into the shop. I bought a lot from him at very reasonable prices, and then returned to buy even more, with Parag Abaya asking me not to tell the neighbouring dealers how cheaply he'd sold them to me. The strange thing is that most of it I cannot sell via Patrick at any price, whereas the tourist pieces at least turn over. I later found my experience to be true for all the dealers on the road to Ciputat, including Parag Abaya. It would seem that the market collapsed shortly before IKEA arrived in Indonesia, as it did for antique furnishings in the UK. Nevertheless, we became regular visits to Parag Abaya store and his home, often eating with him, but not buying any more unsaleable stock. Parag Abaya is everything Maddy's Dukun brother would like to be, but unmistakably isn't. Parag Abaya is an old hippie in the Indonesian way, with long dark hair, apparently dyed as it's now mostly grey, and a liking for ethnic Indonesian clothing. In fact, if he didn't have the dark skin of somebody from East Java, not unlike the Balinese, he would look just like the sarong-wearing residents of Ubud. Like Maddy's priori persona, he does this effortlessly. He shuns the title Dukun, as Dukun are created through being found by their first clients, who, if thought to be good, are rewarded through word of mouth with more clients. Parag Abaya clearly knows far more than Maddy's brother, being connected to the Kraton in Cirebon and Solo, and wears a chain of uncut rubies around his neck, given to him by the Sultan. Parag Abaya was originally from Banyuwangi, where Javanese Sufism meets Balinese Hinduism. It is also noted for its dukuns. In 1998 to 9, murders of 230 dukun took place by people in ninja outfits, following a moral panic of presumed treachery of Dukun Santet. There were reports that it was politically motivated, although there are conflicting claims as to who exactly was behind the murders. Nevertheless, pro-Suharto loyalists, they took place both before and after his deposition, and the army keep cropping up in these allegations, who naturally counterclaim that it was the communists, who had, however, and still remain banned since Suharto seized power. Equally, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that the local people had become fed up with the use of black magic and the deaths from Busong, where the victim's stomach swells as a result of it being inhabited by many foreign bodies, such as insects, nails, and other household items. Certainly, that is what some academics have claimed, but then this is exactly what the locals would tell a visiting academic, still fearful of the redistribution from Suharto supporters. Whilst the scale gives these murders some notoriety, around the same time the killing of Dukuns took place in Malang and Sukabumi. Parag Abaya appears to use what many would call white magic. He uses his knowledge to fight the black magic of the Dukun Santet, but he knows that faith and religion are what really works, and this is what he tells the people who consult him. Despite using the term black magic throughout, it would be more precise to simply call it magic with a K. However, I really don't want to compare my experiences to the practice of Western magic with a K, despite there being amazingly strong parallels, possibly revealing a common Egyptian root. I say Egyptian root, but if the hypothesis on Sunderland are correct, then a common route from Sunderland via Egypt is entirely plausible, which would really place a different interpretation on everything. According to Kajawan, there is no good and evil per se, only a scale of honesty of one's intentions. Despite this, most Indonesians cling to the terms white and black magic without defining where one ends and the other begins, mirroring its practice in Indonesia and, more contentiously, I would argue, the whole world. Like most Dukuns, Parag Abaya also takes Jamu and collects batu, precious and semi-precious stones, which he claims simply appear in his house, vintage keris, and almost anything of craftsmanship, including European leather boots. He also appears to have a strong affiliation with Nia Aurora Keedle, having a large painting of her in his house. Apparently he sold it to a lady from Manado, who later returned it to him, asking for him to keep it for her. He also has a painting by Limaya Dimep, which I has always somewhat admired, despite not being keen on the genre. Banyuwangi was directly governed by the Dutch East Indies Company, and therefore Banyuwangi did not remain under the influence of one of Java's Kratons. The Dutch East Indies Company encouraged the locals to convert to Islam, as Indonesian Hindus fight to the death. Indeed, the conquest of Bali brought with it mass suicides, including those near Sanur. From what I can gather, Parag Abaya's family were the closest one came to nobility in the area, holding the position of spiritual leaders, kaya or sheikh. Like him, they appear to have been avid collectors of most things, but in his early years, Parag Abaya was something of a rebel, getting drunk with the now famous rock star Irwan Fales. Irwan was arrested and questioned during Suharto's military dictatorship, and is another of Jokowi's favourites. As a result, Parag Abaya appears to have been cut off by his religious family, although he did inherit their collection of what I presume the rest of the family felt to be worthless. Despite speaking no English, I now consider Parag Abaya as my best friend in Indonesia. A little like my relationship with Maddy, we seemingly have so little in common, whilst we have so much where it really counts. Parag Abaya even provides an explanation to mine and Maddy's relationship, claiming that she is made from fire and I am from water. Matties' dreams were becoming more regular and sinister, although she always had them. Now these involved people or demons trying to kill her or enter her body. She would wake up crying, "Allah Akbar!" or I would wake her as soon as I became aware. These always occurred after midnight and finished before 4 in the morning, occasionally ending abruptly at 4. That is except when we were in Sanur for the New Year. Then they ended at 5 in the morning, but Bali is 1 hour ahead of Jakarta, where it was still 4. The presence or presences that I dismissed in our kitchen and home became more and more powerful, so that despite not believing in them, I did become aware of them. I could feel a discernible lowering of temperature whenever I went towards our bedroom. Whatever it was getting more powerful and seemed more determined to harm Bude and Maddy. I'd arranged a meeting in Pacific Place shopping mall. We arrived far too early, as the MRT was under construction right by our home, rendering it impossible to estimate how long it would take to get anywhere north of us, and being in the south, that is everywhere. It was just as well, as I couldn't find where we were meant to meet. Indonesians always providing adequate information when arranging meetings, such as meet me in the Starbucks at a certain mall, without saying there are 4 Starbucks in that mall, and it would take over an hour to visit each one. Should you arrive early and find where you were meeting about 15 minutes before you were due to meet, you will get a text saying, "Just about to leave home, I'll be a little late," as though you could turn back the hands of time and wait at home for another hour or two. You will then get regular texts informing you of their progress, and then 2 hours late they'll arrive. Ngoyan is the worst at this. He even asks how long I will stay in Jakarta, then contacts me after I have left. Since moving to Tangga and Bangtan, it's been impossible to meet with Ian, despite still considering him to be a good friend. Can you imagine a Brit with a preoccupation with space and time coping here? Having explained about Jamkaret, there is one aspect in which Indonesians are much more precise about time, as in the West the day officially changes when the clock passes midnight, but to Indonesian Muslims what we would call a new day begins after sunset. Actually, I think the time between Maghrib and Isha I think the time between Maghrib and is undefined, making it a prime time for paranormal activity. This often confuses me when trying to understand auspicious days in the Muslim or Javanese calendar. With my preoccupation with time, I'm mildly irritated when late for an appointment as a result of bad traffic, and upon arrival you're told a better route. I'm irritated, as what is the possible point of telling you after you have arrived? It only serves to reinforce your stupidity and tardiness. More costly is when you're asked to rearrange appointments at the last minute for an urgent meeting in a location which is difficult for you to get to. In Indonesia, this is a test of your friendship, and if you drop your other meetings and arrange last-minute transport, you will be rewarded for being included in future business. But of course, in my case, this business has never actually come to fruition, only causing me even more expense. Some of these interactions are not uncommon in the UK, but in Indonesia there is a further variant. Every day I'm asked why I don't buy this or that consumer goods. Often these are for items I have no desire whatsoever, such as saloon-style ceiling fans for our modernist home, called minimalist in Indonesia, in Gunung Kidul. But the main item is a car. I find affordable cars in Indonesia ugly beyond imagination, whilst European cars are subject to a 300% import tax. Add to this, Jakarta's traffic is such that I just become stressed. So owning a car would also require hiring a driver, as many middle-class Indonesian families do. Finally, in our kampong, with its narrow gangs, ginnels, I have nowhere to park a car. So the whole idea is ridiculous to me, as me not having one is ridiculous to Indonesians. Indeed, the very reason why so many Jakartans have moved to Tangerang, Banten is that their homes have spaces for their cars. But cars are only required because it's so far from anywhere anyone would want to be. The twist to this particular consumerist mind game is that no sooner have you bought an item and you will be told, even by the people who recommended it to you, that your particular choice is a bad one and that a better product should have been bought. Add to this, as a bully you will have been overcharged, which provides another source of ridicule when discussing your purchase. Our meeting place wasn't marked on the mall directory, but I seem to remember that it was next to Starbucks. So we made our way to the Starbucks, ordered drinks, and I sent a text. After a few sips, I got a text back to say that we were directly below our proposed meeting place. So Maddy and I had to find an escalator and move up. Maddy quickly left us, as she loved shopping in Pacific Place. She would be gone for hours, and we had lots to discuss. Pacific Place is debatably the most exclusive mall in Jakarta, and forms a part of Jakarta's CBD, and is attached to one of Jakarta's Ritz-Carlton hotels, the most expensive in the city. The area has more recently become the centre for upmarket nightlife in Jakarta. On the ground floor of Pacific Place is a shop with a Maserati in it. You couldn't describe it as a showroom, but nevertheless it sells one a week. It also has all the luxury brands you could imagine, often in their own dedicated stores. I remember one time in Pacific Place when Maddy was pursued by a seemingly wealthy Indonesian who wanted her to have coffee with him. He persisted, despite her letting him know that her husband was also in the mall. Rather like not believing I am not incredibly wealthy, Indonesian men all assume that Maddy only married me for my money and would jump at the opportunity for some extramarital bleep with a real Indonesian man. This is despite most Indonesian males being aware of Westerners' larger penis size and being preoccupied with size as indicative of virility and therefore presumed desirability. Reputedly, Indonesian males are larger than other East Asians, so they are generally quite smug about the size of their manhood. But speaking to Indonesian girls who are able to provide a comparison, size is not so important. Indonesian males are firm like a stick and thrust vigorously, while Western males slowly fill them like boiled rice. some girls preferring the more violent and others the tenderer interaction. An hour later, Maddy returned, looking as black as an abandoned pan. I'd never seen her look like this before. Her personality is normally that of Blackpool's Golden Mile, and I could tell something was wrong, so I quickly ended the meeting. My associates were looking at my contradiction of a wife, dressed in shorts and a revealing top, but tightly clutching on to tasbih, Islamic prayer beads. Maddy explained to me that something had attacked her while wandering around Pacific Place. She was feeling heavy and could hardly walk. I later realised that this was a perfect description for the arthritis-like symptoms one can get with flu, when it feels like the whole body aches. Maddy was obviously very frightened and asked to be taken to Parag Abaya. But Maddy would never visit a Dukun. We'd often laughed about Parag Abaya, saying that we must take Lima, her friend from FTs, who spends at least 10% of her money on Dukuns. In the taxi, Maddy became progressively worse, something close to a panic attack. Although we had told Parag Abaya about Budde's problems, we'd not said a lot, but as soon as we entered his shop, he knew exactly what was wrong. He sat Maddy down in his attached home and gave her a glass of warm salted water, which immediately relieved her. He also encouraged her to put it on her body to reduce the heat, which she did, and it did. Whilst Maddy was recovering, we could hear Parag Abaya speaking to someone whom I believed was Sultan Anom, the 12th of Chirban, on his phone about what was happening. It was clearly serious. He sent Maddy away with a miniature Chris that the Sultan had given to him, which he told her to keep with her at all times and to sleep with it under a pillow. Parag Abaya promised to visit us that evening, but we were to lay salt around the house and keep making warm salted water. The house was already full of salt and garlic that Maddy's brother had suggested we use, but a little more was placed in our bedroom. That evening, Parag Abaya appeared at our home with Ibu Dayanti. Ibu Dayanti gave Maddy a massage, whilst Parag Abaya inspected our property. He would never say much, not wanting to feed Maddy's thoughts, but kept saying to me, "Very bad, mister." The kitchen was indeed absolutely infested with evil spirits, but the whole house was losing its balance. He placed Wafak Islamic verses and Jimat around the house, including a wild boar's tusk from Kalimantan, Borneo. Parag Abaya returned the next day with even more Jimat. Later he explained to me, in a mixture of his few English words and Bahasa, that our house was now Sehat, safe. The neighbours were indeed to blame, but telling us who would only make us angry and would make whatever was happening worse. What he had found in the kitchen was large and unmentionable, but he had removed it. He concluded that Maddy was a good person with strong powers and could overcome this herself through prayer. He was also concerned for Budde and that she should visit him on her return, which she never did. Parag Abaya also gave Maddy and I some flower petals to use when we showered, which felt lovely. In fact, we must do it more often. He also recommended that Maddy get a thorough checkup with a doctor, which seemed bizarre to me given the paranormal nature of the problems. We never did, despite his insistence that this was a necessary precaution when experiencing a paranormal attack. As Parag Abaya left, he seemed to be sniffing in the air in the direction of Pa and Ibu Ertes, rather than on Muni's. He was clearly very troubled by what was going on. Parag Abaya later explained to Maddy that his own parents had been killed by Busong, and that is why he had studied how to protect himself, which also meant that he could help others. But he never said much to Maddy. He was always calm, always listened, and rarely commenting. Despite my scepticism about all that was happening, I have complete faith in Parag Abaya. Indeed, he provided me with a link to forces, even a universe I neither comprehended nor believed existed. Well, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. By all means, feel free to comment on it, including criticism, as that's the only way I can improve. Now, I really do hate it when channels keep badgering you to subscribe for them. But I suppose it does tell you when I'm going to post new chapters. I'm aiming to do this every week to 10 days, so it might be a good idea to subscribe if you want to. But thank you again for listening.